Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Assemblymember Lori Wilson. I have the distinct pleasure of representing the 11th Assembly District. I also chair the Assembly Transportation Committee. And so just so you know, the session is being recorded and will be available on the committee's website. In 2015, the California Legislature passed AB 1056. Establishing our current three-tier system for electric bicycles. This allowed for broader adoption by removing motorcycle licensing and insurance requirements for these devices. The intent was to provide an environmentally friendly mode of transportation to replace car trips and reduce vehicle miles traveled, also known as VMT, and lower greenhouse gas emissions. That policy succeeded. We have seen an explosion in e-bike use, creating a multi-billion-dollar industry, and research confirms these devices are effectively replacing car trips across our entire state. However, this growth has brought about challenges. We have seen a rise in injuries and fatalities, alongside a large influx of high-speed devices that are marketed as e-bikes, but do not meet legal classifications. This has necessitated further legislative action. In 2025 alone, 5 e-bike bills were signed into law. To ensure our policies are rooted in data, the legislature passed SB 381 in 2023, tasking the Mineta Transportation Institute, also known as MTI, with analyzing our e-bike laws and providing recommendations for improvement. Joining us today is Dr. Asha Weinstein Agrawal. Did I say that right? Thank you. Professor of Urban Planning at San Jose State University and a lead researcher with MTI. Dr. Agrawal also serves as the Institute's Education Director and Director of MTI's National Transportation Finance Center. In December 2025, she released the report required by SB 381, titled Exploring Electric Bicycle Safety Performance Data and Policy Options for California. This year, at least 9 e-bike related bills have been introduced, including my own, many of which draw directly from her research. I want to thank the professor for being here to present her findings. Following her presentation, we will open the door from the floor for questions from everyone who's present here today. And with that, I pass it over to the professor.
Thank you so much, Assemblymember Wilson, for that introduction and for inviting me to be here. As a researcher, it's always, thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here, and as a researcher, always delightful to know that my research isn't just like off on a dusty shelf somewhere, but people are considering what value they can take from it. So I have some slides that I will go through. I'll be sharing those with the committee, and I imagine they'll probably be posted if anybody wants them later. So you've already heard that what I'm here to talk about today is a study that was commissioned by the California Legislature and supported by the Mineta Transportation Institute. And I also want to acknowledge my co-author, Kevin Fang, who's with Sonoma State. So I think that what we're really, the legislature is grappling with is how do we balance sort of the true, really meaningful benefits that e-bikes offer our residents and our communities more broadly with the very real safety concerns. So on the benefit side, e-bikes are kind of amazing. They're not for everybody. They're not for every trip. But for many people, for at least some of their trips, they offer cheap and very convenient mobility, including for people who may not have great other options if they can't afford to drive, don't live near transit, and so forth. Also, to the extent that an e-bike trip is replacing a car trip, we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is obviously a very important policy goal for the state of California. We're reducing traffic congestion. There are fewer people fighting for car parking spots. And I think that there's also a real potential to improve road safety. And I know that might seem a little counterintuitive since we're here to talk about the safety challenges, and those are real. But I like to ask myself and everyone else, if you're a pedestrian and you have to be hit by something or someone, would you rather be hit by a crazy, reckless driver on an e-bike or a crazy, reckless driver driving a car. And I'm pretty sure that everyone here is probably thinking, well, if it has to happen, I will take the e-bike rider. You know, they have their safety challenges, but they are frankly just much less dangerous than motor vehicles. But against all these really important benefits, we do have these safety concerns. And I think it's useful to just quickly sort of outline the range of concerns. One is the e-bike riders themselves being injured. Occasionally there have been fatalities. And there are two sort of reasons that these incidents happen. Some are collisions with motor vehicles. And then the other is solo crashes, which is kind of transportation safety language for the e-bike rider hit a tree or just lost control or, you know, somehow fell off without another road user being directly involved. But then there's also concerns about the safety for other road users, the people around the e-bike riders. It's not common, but there are unfortunately documented cases where other people, often pedestrians, have been injured or killed as a result of a collision with an e-bike. And then I think what's much more common, and depending on what communities you live in, you may have already experienced this, is pedestrians and sometimes motor vehicle drivers feeling kind of threatened and intimidated by people riding e-bikes in an aggressive way, often groups of teenagers. And that last is not necessarily in and of itself a safety concern, but I think it very much creates for some people a concern that they just in general don't feel as safe maybe walking around if there are lots of e-bikes in use. So how do we balance these real benefits? So allow as many people to use e-bikes as conveniently as possible while keeping the safety of everybody on the road in mind and taking reasonable precautions. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to just, because I suspect there's sort of a variety of expertise about e-bikes in the room, I'll talk a little about e-bike basics. We don't know a lot, but a little bit about the data we have on how many people use e-bikes and how many of them there are. Talk a little bit about sort of thinking, what are the questions about safety that we really might want to answer, and then get to what I've found from our research about how dangerous are e-bikes. And then in the last two sections, talking through some policy options. I'll spend most of that time talking about material related to the bills that these Chair Wilson has introduced and sort of the other motor vehicle code changes that we could think about, and then finally, very quickly, just run through some other things that where the state could take an important role and the legislature could be very valuable. So first, some e-bike device basics. California, like most, although not quite all states in the United States, has a three-class system of e-bikes, and you already mentioned it was adopted, I think, 2015. So for all of them, there is a required maximum that the motor have a 750 watt maximum power. And there's some other things that all the bikes have to have, but the key thing to know is that we have this three-class system, where class 1 means that the motor is assisting the cyclist, but only while the cyclist is actively pedaling, so that gets called pedal assist, and the motor will cut out at 20 miles per hour. That's not to say someone couldn't go faster than 20 miles an hour if they have the strength and the desire to just use their own pedaling to go faster. Now, class 2 has the same maximum assisted speed, but the difference here is that you don't have to pedal. So you can operate the bike with a throttle. So like on a motorcycle, you might twist something. That's typically the sort of way these devices function. Then class 3 we're back to no throttle. It has to be only pedal assist, but the motor will take you up to 28 miles per hour. By the way, this isn't a main feature of what I'm going to be talking about, but nobody understands the class system. I mean, really, like transportation planners aren't quite sure. I think many law enforcement officers aren't quite sure. And that's not because these people are not caring and trying to do a job. It's because it's not a very intuitive, logical system. So that's a little side note. However, so we have these three different classes or types of legal e-bikes. But then there's this whole sort of ecosystem of other, what I will call bicycle-shaped devices with electric motors. So they look like a bicycle. They have two wheels. People can pedal them, and they have an electric motor and a battery, but they don't meet the legal definitions either because they're too powerful. The wattage is above 750 watts, and or they'll assist the rider at speeds greater than 20 or 28 miles an hour. So I'm going to keep coming back to this again and again today, but one of the key challenges we have is when we hear about safety incidents, we don't actually know, was this a legal e-bike, or was this one of these bicycle-shaped devices that's not actually a legal e-bike? Some people call those e-motos. I find that can be a little confusing with motorcycles and electric motorcycles, so I don't usually use that term myself, but if you've been thinking about this issue, you probably will hear e-motos thrown about. Next, just in the e-bike basics, I want to put 750 watts of power to sort of in a context, because for most of us, that's very abstract. What does that mean? So if we think about an adult, just your average, like any one of us, assuming you know how to ride a bicycle, riding down the street, recreationally, whatever, very, very approximately, we can generate a continuous 100 watts of power. Now, if we all suddenly became Tour de France competitors or pro cyclists, we could probably continuously generate something in the general order of 300 watts of power. The 750 watts of power that is in our legislation right now is literally the power of a horse. It's 1 horsepower, which is 750 watts. So we have my rather silly looking cartoon, but hopefully it kind of drills into us that that's a lot of power and it seems functionally quite different from a human-powered bicycle. Okay, so, and we're gonna come back a bit later to that. But again, and just to sort of wrap up on this bicycle-shaped devices with electric motors, I'm a professor, so I have my little quiz. This is not actually a quiz, but here are 9 devices that if you just saw them bicycling by you, or traveling by you, I should say, you could easily think that they're all e-bikes, but they're not. Some of them are, some of them are not, and it is not something anybody can just glance at a device and tell. And so that sort of furthers this problem of we have all these legal, but then the other illegal devices. Give you one example here of one of these bicycle-shaped devices that's not a legal e-bike. Segway has the Cyber electric bike, and by the way, I'm just using Segway as an example. There are many other manufacturers that produce similar devices. But they have 2 variants of this. One of the variants advertises a 3,000 watt motor. So if you can imagine my bicycle with a horse, now we've got 4 horses stacked on top of each other, or maybe whatever. And then they have a 2 battery variant, which is literally 8 horsepower. That's a lot of horses moving the bicycle along. Okay. So now let me turn to e-bike use and ownership. The first thing to know is that unfortunately we really don't know a lot. There's not great data that I have certainly been able to find on how many devices are owned or who's using them, but let me share some of the basic facts that I have been able to dig up. So, and I think this is probably very well known, but there has been a rapid rise in the number of e-bikes that have been sold and are being used in our communities. And I haven't seen California-specific numbers, but as best I can find, if we want to think of the fleet, like all the e-bikes that are owned by people living in the US right now, it's something around 7 million. And if we compare the number in 2020 to the number at the end of 2025, it is a 49 times increase. So a very, very fast rise. Oops, I actually had meant this to go earlier. Sorry, I was working till midnight last night. So another thing to wonder is like, okay, well that's the number of devices out there, but well, how many people are actually riding them? And here, there are 3 national surveys that I pulled from that in 2024 and 2025 that all kind of roughly found about 10% of US adults are riding e-bikes, at least occasionally. That doesn't mean they're all regular riders. And unfortunately, I have not found any data on the number of children and teenagers using e-bikes. If anyone finds it, please let me know. Now, I talked earlier about the different classes. So we have the 3 legal classes of e-bikes and then the bicycle-shaped devices that are not legal. Again, very little clear data about how many of each kind have been sold, but there was a 2025 kind of market insights report that found that in 2024, almost half, 43% of the devices sold were class 1. So that means it's pedal assist only, there's no throttle, and the maximum assisted speed is 20 miles an hour. These are the sort of gentlest e-bikes. However, the report also found that the fastest growing segment of devices being sold were ones that had motors above 750 watts, so by definition, not legal e-bikes. Okay, so that's a little bit about sort of how many of them are out there. Next, let me just talk through, if we're thinking about e-bike safety, what data is there available for that, and what do we want to know? So there's sort of good news, bad news. There's not a lot of data, and it's not very high quality, so I'll lay that on the table. That is the bad news. But, we do have kind of hints and clues that we can draw from. There is data from hospital records of patients. If an ambulance picks you up, they have to file a report. So we have some data from emergency medical service providers. And there are not many fatalities, but there are a few, and researchers can look to death certificates. Also, police, if a collision report is filed, and if the device is identified as an e-bike, then we do have those police collision reports. So there are a lot of different places we can look. Unfortunately, all of these have major limitations. And the single biggest one I want to emphasize is we don't really know what the devices were that have gotten reported as an e-bike. If you look back to my, my quiz time, do we really think that your average emergency room, aide taking down a report is digging into the details to figure out if that was a legal e-bike or not? Certainly not. And even law enforcement, for the most part, I think they aren't necessarily aware that it would be important to note the distinction. And again, they can't necessarily just look at a device and know. So the data I'm going to show you is data for, I would argue, all of these different legal and illegal devices lumped together. Also, even if anybody does try to, even less likely is that they've reported the class of e-bike. So as policymakers, we'd probably like to know, well, hey, are those class 1, just as dangerous as class 2 or 3, or maybe some of them are less dangerous, but it's hard to tell that from the data. And this is not unique to e-bikes, but there is almost no record of most people who are injured or in a crash riding an e-bike. It's just people go to their urgent care of their local doctor, or they don't seek medical treatment, and there's not enough damage or injury that the police, and there are also cases where the police are called to the scene of incident but choose not to submit a collision report because of sort of local policies on what rises to the level of seriousness where a collision report is required. Now, what we would like to know to set good sort of evidence-based policy are, first of all, how many incidents are actually occurring and how severe are the medical outcomes. But that's kind of numbers in a vacuum. So we would ideally really like to know something about the rate of e-bike incidents. And you could measure that as per e-bike trip that anybody takes, how often is there an incident, or for every 100 miles ridden on an e-bike, how many incidents are there? We also, I think it's important to think about how the numbers of e-bike injuries compare to similar devices like human-powered bicycles and e-scooters. If we're going to regulate e-bikes very differently from those other kinds of devices, we should be confident that there are actually a different risk profile for these devices. And then finally, it would be wonderful, and we really don't know much, but to know what are the factors that correlate with serious e-bike incidents? Is it specific types of street designs? Is it riders who have certain characteristics, like their age? Are there certain motorist behaviors that are typically more likely to result in an e-bike incident? So unfortunately, we don't really have we kind of know the answer to number one, and sort of number three. I'll show you a few things on that in a second, but especially for 2 and 4, we really have very, very little idea. So, okay, that was a long preamble. Now we finally get to what do we know about how dangerous e-bikes are. First of all, the number of recorded crashes and injuries each year is rising fast, but then again, so is the number of e-bikes. We also know, and I think this is a really important context, so there's a reason we're all here gathered together, and our legislators are spending a lot of effort on e-bike legislation. There is a real safety problem. We are seeing more and more people, often seriously injured. But it is still also true that far fewer people are injured on a reported e-bike, which, by the way, is probably a lot of non-e-bikes, but still. Far fewer people are in reported e-bike injuries than are injured in many of other travel modes, including conventional bicycles and cars. And I'm going to show you 2 different data sources that can illustrate the same point. So this is drawing from a national set of emergency room patients. And for those who care, it's something called NICE, the National Electronic Injury Surveillance System, produced by the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission. And what we're showing you here is from 2020 to 2024. That was the most recent data we had available. The number of patients who were treated who were using different sort of transportation modes. And the e-bikes, I don't know if you can see my cursor, that sort of the thickest red line, that's e-bikes. So the first thing I think is that if you looked at this and if you asked yourself, like, what can we do to reduce injuries to people traveling in our streets? You would not immediately glom on to the e-bikes and think that's where the real problem is. No, I mean, yes, it's going up. That red line is absolutely going up, but it is still dwarfed by the number of people injured just riding conventional bicycles, and, is kind of roughly in the range of a lot of other kinds of small-wheeled devices. Now, it's not quite as recent, it's 2023, but we do have a little bit of data from California hospitals that I also wanted to share. So this is the publicly available data. By the way, the Department of Public Health has access to sort of more of the details, and I hope that they will do their own deep dive analysis because we'd learn more. But these are people who are treated in hospitals, either in the emergency room or as an admitted patient in 2023. And it's different kind of modes of transportation. Again, I don't think you would look at this and say, e-bikes, that is the absolute most dangerous thing happening on our streets right now. So there were about 5,000 e-bike patients treated in 2023, but there were roughly almost 10 times as many people again on conventional bikes, and we had close to 300,000 who were in a motor vehicle, either as a driver or passenger, who were injured. So yes, we do not want to ignore e-bikes. We want to try and change laws, policies, educate people, but it's also important to remember that this is not the major safety issue on our streets in California. And I should also reiterate again, I know I will sound a little boring here, but those were the things that were recorded as e-bike incidents, but we don't actually know how many of them were legal e-bikes. And I realize I think I neglected to put my slide in here that I was going to show. We do have one sort of clue about how many of these devices being ridden are legal versus illegal e-bikes. And that comes from some advocates in the Bay Area who have gone to middle schools and high schools, and with permission from the school administrators, looked at all the bikes that students park on campus during the day. And these advocates, for everything that has two wheels, pedals, and an electric motor, they take some pictures, document it, and then go home and look up, based on the brand, the device, if there's a model number, whether there's an obvious throttle, to ask, is this a legal or e-bike or something else? And very consistently, it almost seemed too consistent, I asked them to go back and check their numbers, but across Santa Clara schools, San Mateo County schools, Marin County, East Bay, like 80 to 90% were not legal e-bikes. And I just want to say that again. So almost all of them were not legal e-bikes. Now, maybe these advocates weren't perfect. Maybe they made some mistakes. But I think, even if for 20% of them, they were wrong, that's still like 2/3 of these devices are not legal e-bikes. And so this is just a snapshot. This is just what tweens and teens are riding. It's just devices that they're riding and parking at schools. So we certainly can't assume that that's a good reflection of the entire fleet of e-bikes in California. But it's also true that a lot of the safety concerns do relate to teens and tweens. And so I think we really have to stop and ask ourselves, how many of these injuries were the kinds of devices that are sort of being regulated as e-bikes versus just other things? Other things we know are that when patients are treated in hospitals on reported e-bikes, the incidents are on average more serious than those in conventional bicycle accidents. And some of the data we look at put it sort of similar to the kinds of the seriousness of if you're on an e-scooter, or in New York City, actually, it was actually not that different from motorcycle patients. And it makes sense. If you're going a lot faster and you crash, you're more likely to get seriously injured. One thing that is not, which I think is surprising to many people, is that the majority of reported e-bike incidents, if we look at the national data, or the statewide data that we have had available, it's not kids. Actually, the greatest number of people are adults. So yes, we want to focus a lot on kids, but we need to remember that this is a problem for everybody, not just for children riding e-bikes. Also, while there are a few people who have tragically died or been injured by somebody riding an e-bike, say a pedestrian, it's a tiny fraction. It's quite rare. And then again, I'm going to sound like a broken record. Most of these reported incidents probably weren't a legal e-bike. We don't know how many, but some proportion, possibly quite a large fraction. And I do want to acknowledge that certain local data has been collected from a particular county or hospital, and there are definitely some deviations from that pattern, where we see much higher percentages of injuries being kids and other things. And also, at least what I have found, there's not a lot of really recent data, and we do know that it's changing sort of month to month. So hopefully soon we'll be able to get a better picture on more recent data. So we know that there are a lot of there's a rising number of e-bike injuries. Some of them are quite serious. It's not the major safety problem on our streets, but still, we want to do something. So I'm going to talk first about the recommendations that my partner and I came with as to how to define e-bikes more appropriately, and maybe change the class system. And so I like to think of three sort of objectives behind that we might try and achieve if we were to change the way the California Vehicle Code regulates these devices. The first is to create simple, intuitive rules. If people don't know the rules, if they can't understand them or can't remember them, we certainly can't expect people to follow those rules. And I would argue, as I said at the beginning, the e-bike 3-class system, just people do not know what it is. And I don't have a lot of faith that we can, in the next year, educate the entire population of California effectively. Secondly, I think we do want to try to preserve an e-bike option for everybody, or everybody who can ride a device like this and wants to. So that includes kids, it includes people who, for whatever reason, don't want to or can't get a driver's license. But we also, I think, do want to preserve the device options that offer more power. I think it would be a shame if we just sort of banned all of the higher powered devices and said, well, either you're on something, very slow and safe, or you have to ride a motorcycle or a moped. So those are the kind of 3 objectives I keep coming back to as we think about, well, what might California want to do? So one thing that I strongly recommend is that we revisit this 750-watt maximum power that's in California law and most states. So if we want there to be a class of device that we call electric bicycles that we regulate the same way we regulate bicycles, kids can ride them, you don't need a driver's license, do we want those devices to have the power of the pro cyclist or the horse? And right now, because of the way many manufacturers have interpreted this 750 watts, they've interpreted it as continuous power. And so that puts us into the horse picture. We are, in the United States, completely out of step with the rest of the world. So if you look to European Union countries, if you look at China, at Japan, Australia, et cetera, they actually regulate continuous power, and that's, again, sort of the pro-cyclist level, and they tend to set regulations at 250, 300 watts. Very, very different from what we do in California. And so I think that's something that it is well worth, I believe, changing. So I think, but again, I come back to the idea that I hope that California can have the safe e-bike versions that anybody can use, but also preserve these more higher performance options for other people who want them and can use them. And I think that we can achieve that. Nothing's simple when it comes to laws, but conceptually at least, relatively simply, by just doing what the rest of the world does. So that we have e-bikes that have less powerful motors, and we could debate exactly how we define that, but one option is to say that the 750 watts we already use is the peak power. So the power your device could momentarily generate, but not what you can continuously generate. So these devices we could then treat pretty much the way the law already does as legally equivalent to a bicycle. No license, any age, you can ride them on bike paths. But then, instead of just banning the higher powered devices, we essentially make them mopeds. And so if you're a moped, there's a minimum age. You do have to have a motorcycle license. You have to wear a helmet. The device has to have some additional safety equipment that isn't required on e-bikes right now, such as turn signals. And what I like about this two-class, I hesitate to use the word class, but this two-category system is, first of all, it's simple. There are just 2 of them. And it builds off device sort of types that people are already used to. We already have bicycles. We already have mopeds. So instead of creating yet a new, different set of rules where people now have to remember, well, what's the difference between this and this and this and this? It's just, okay, am I riding a bicycle or am I riding something that's equivalent to a moped? And this is what the rest of the world is currently doing. So finally, and I'm going to talk very quickly through these, there are lots of other things that I think the state legislature and local governments can do that would be really valuable. Funding safe bicycle infrastructure, I think, is a pretty obvious, but what are like small, then often these are not huge redesigns, but small changes that we can give the way we design streets so that e-bikes and all the other small devices have a safe place to ride, such as bike lanes. And then this gets a little more wonky into, traffic engineering, but there are ways to redesign the streets so that motorists are just more likely to see the e-bike riders, less likely to, say, make a turn right in front of a bicycle or an e-bike and hit that device. Very important, and there's legislation that's been introduced about this, is I think we have to do a good job, not just a better job, but we have to do a good job of letting consumers know what they're buying. Right now, there are all these things that call themselves e-bikes, if you go to the website or read the literature, that are not. And let us face it, how is the general public supposed to know that, well, this thing called an e-bike is a legal one in California and those other things aren't? We certainly can't expect people to go check the motor vehicle code to figure it out before they buy it. And so one, I think fairly straightforward and probably quite impactful change is to require that anybody selling a so-called e-bike, or let me say, anyone selling a bicycle-shaped device that has an electric motor must very clearly disclose to the buyer, is this a legal e-bike in California or not? And if it is it a class 1, 2, or 3? Of course, there are always going to be some people who don't care, they just want what they want, but I think a lot of people, especially a lot of the parents who are buying devices for their teenagers, if they knew that they were buying something very high-powered that was essentially really a moped and not a bicycle, they would stop buying them. But we haven't yet empowered them to sort of have that information easily available. And then also there are things you can do to sort of, have county district attorneys or the state attorney general facilitating enforcement of those disclosure requirements. Another thing, and this I think is quite controversial, we've seen a lot of local governments passing their own regulations. There have been some state legislation allowing, both in San Diego and Marin counties, cities to adopt, lower minimum age requirements and other things. So there's this desire, I think, by local governments to create their own rules to address the problems that they're experiencing. But I don't think that California should move to allowing a kind of patchwork system where the rules change every time you change, cross from one city to the next or from one county to another. And I'll use age as minimums as an example, but imagine if the minimum age to drive a car changed from city to city. I mean, it's just not workable. There's no way that people are going to know, oops, I was, in Folsom and I had to be 16, but now I'm in Sacramento and I have to be 17. It's just, again, you can't expect people to follow rules that they don't understand. Now, I do think there certainly is a place for local governments to add some additional restrictions, but I think these probably should be very limited place-based requirements, such as in a crowded pedestrian neighborhood, you can't ride your e-bike on the sidewalk. Maybe certain bike facilities, you can't ride an e-bike. And that we have very good prominent signage all over the place so that riders actually are aware of these limitations. And again, just most of us are more familiar with the experience of driving, so I'll use that as an analogy. Speed limits change as you're driving around our communities, but you're not expected to just sort of intuitively know that you left a 35-mile-per-hour zone and you're now in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. It's clearly signed, and we should be doing the same thing if we have local variations to e-bike rules. I think there's a great role to educate people about what the rules for riding e-bikes are. Right now, literally, if you want to find out from the state of California, like, okay, what are the rules I need to follow as a rider of an e-bike, the only place that's available is in the motor vehicle code. Nobody's going to look at it, and even if they did, trust me, I've had conversations where it's like 2 professors and 2 grad students, and we're not lawyers, and we're staring and like, what do they mean? It's very confusing. So just as we don't expect motor vehicle drivers to read the motor vehicle code. We give them the nice, driver's handbook that's written in plain, simple language and tell, memorize this and you'll know what to do. I hope that we can create an equivalent official state, handbook of rules for probably not just e-bike riders, but bicycles, e-bikes, and all these small devices, so that there is one official place everybody can go and can get accurate information. Because right now what's happening is a lot of bike advocacy organizations, personal injury lawyers, some local governments are putting out, hey, here's our cheat sheet of the rules, but many of them are inaccurate. They'll be 95% correct, but there'll be a mistake here and there, and they're not comprehensive. They have some of the rules, but not all of the rules. And then there are things, public education campaigns, and I dream of the day when, schools teach every kid safe bicycle riding and e-bike riding. Minnesota actually just passed a law a couple years ago that requires bicycle education in, I think, elementary and middle schools. It's quite exciting to me. Maybe someday we'll have something like that in California. Going back to the data piece, we will be able to just make much better sort of evidence-based policy choices if we have a firmer understanding of what the problem really is. And so that's going to require better data. Fortunately, we already have processes like hospital patient records to collect data. I think we just need to work with, medical community and the police so that they change the forms they report their data on, so we get more information about what kind of device this is, particularly like the make and model, maybe if there's a throttle or not. And then the second is harder, but just start to get more information about, what was happening at the time of that incident, where did it happen, what was the driver or the e-bike rider doing, was it nighttime, all those that really will let us see, are there certain conditions that are particularly risky where it's appropriate to change policy to reduce the likelihood of crashes. Also, once you collect the data, it's no good to any of us if it doesn't get analyzed and reported out. Our Department of Public Health, to some extent Caltrans, has better data than I've been able to, as a sort of researcher who's not in the state government, analyze. But it's often like years before anything is published, and they don't publish all the details. So I would love to see the legislature kind of direct our state agencies that have this data to actually look at it and publish it, and do so in a sort of timely way so that we're not waiting 2 years to find out what we knew, in 2024, say. I also think that of course, I'm an academic, but I think there's a lot of value that can be added by researchers at, universities or in other institutions. And then another thing that I would say I think would be very valuable is for the legislature to encourage/require that a lot of this research have collaboration between people who are public health experts and transportation experts. And I'm on the transportation side myself. I know that there's a lot I don't know about public health, and that there's expertise people in that community bring. But a lot of what's been published about e-bike safety is coming out from public health research, and a lot of them just don't understand the transportation side of it. They're not really aware of the whole 3-class things or the importance of knowing where incidents happened, et cetera. So I do think we will have by far better, information, all of us, to work from if we can get collaborations between the public health and the transportation community. So with that, I will wrap up. And I believe you are going to open it for questions.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your presentation. It was wonderful. My name is David Sforza. I'm the Principal Consultant for Assembly Transportation Committee, and I'll be analyzing the 9 e-bike legislations that are going through the legislature. If any of you have questions for the professor, now's your time to ask them. Please approach the podium. And come and ask questions. Okay. I'll ask questions then. I'm sorry. There are currently a lot of e-bikes on the road that have greater than 250 watts or have higher than 750 peak wattage. I think electric e-bikes is one of the top-selling e-bike manufacturers in the United States. They are the third most popular electric vehicle in the U.S. And they have an e-bike that has a 300-watt electric motor, but has an 819 peak wattage. What should we do about devices that have a lower continuous wattage, but have peak wattage that is greater than 750?
So I think one of the hard questions is that we do already have, wheeling around our streets, many devices that people have bought in good faith that don't meet the current legal definition of an e-bike, and certainly if we changed it along the lines I've proposed, would no longer. It's a hard transition. I don't know, maybe grandfathering in so that devices that have, are already, people already own, they can still ride legally. Maybe transitioning to the higher power devices, you need to be 16. I don't know. So I think probably some sort of grandfathering, but, we don't want to do what we've always done and never change anything because the transition is hard. So I think that, and again, I just come back to, if we're gonna have devices that we treat like a bicycle, so, your 12-year-old can ride it. You're a person who can't get a driver's license because of, some particular medical condition, but is basically, physically able, and we should have an option for them that makes them a little more like Lance Armstrong, but probably doesn't make them one horse or a whole herd of horses of power with the device.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah. And if you can introduce yourself and what organization you're with, if you're with an
Happy to
organization.
do that. Can you hear me okay? Hi, Jeannie Ward-Waller. I represent People for Bikes as my client. Lovely to see you, Professor. My question was kind of focused on speed, and really appreciate your point, which you reinforced a bunch, that we don't have good data, so it's hard to tell sort of what, the rise in injuries, where is that coming from, what kinds of devices. But I've sort of been ruminating about this issue of speed and speed capability and how that factors in. And we know pretty clearly from auto collision data that above 30 to 35 miles per hour, auto crashes are much more likely to be fatal or serious injury crashes. And so I've sort of been thinking about that in this conversation about how are we regulating speed of e-bikes, that, the low speed under 20, 20 or less, and then even the 28 miles per hour, class 3, none of those, at least if they're actually legally regulated and not be able to go faster than that, they're under that threshold of what would be a speed for an auto collision. And I wonder if you just have given some thought to that, or if you can speculate in terms of, obviously one that goes 60 miles per hour is going to be much higher risk.
Right.
But.
So that's a great question. I don't know of anybody who has data. I actually just saw, and this is where I think sometimes the public health researchers are so good at part of the question, but not very good at the transportation part. I have an article where they claim to be separating high-speed e-bikes from others, but it doesn't. I'm quite sure they're not actually able to do that. So we don't have data on what happens if you crash at 10 miles an hour, at 20 miles an hour, at 40 miles an hour. I think it is fair to say that the basic principles of physics, that the sort of kinetic energy is a measure of your mass or weight plus speed. It's factored together, and if you're going faster, there's much more chance you will be seriously injured. And so I think logically we can assume that that's true. I doubt that the data on kind of tipping points of vehicle driver speed is a great comparison here, just because a driver is encased in, a ton of metal and nowadays airbags, and, bicycle riders don't have that. So actually another kind of research I would love to see is sort of crash dummies on bicycles or e-bikes going at different speeds, and maybe there is like a kind of tipping point where, if you're going under that speed, you're probably not going to have a really, really bad injury. So, and I didn't want to keep you here for an hour lecture, so I didn't talk about speeds, but looking to the rest of the world, they don't have 20 miles an hour as the maximum assisted speed. It's typically more like 25 kilometers, so maybe 16 miles per hour, which I think makes some sense because that is, if we're going to treat these as the legal equivalent of a pedal bicycle, that's more like the speed. No, there's strong cyclists who can go faster than that. Absolutely, or certainly if the hill is steep enough, any of us can probably go fast enough if we choose to on a human-powered bicycle. But, setting an assisted speed that's more like a human cyclist might make sense. And remember, if you're a strong cyclist and you feel confident, you can make the device go faster with your own power. It's not limiting you to that speed. It's just not helping you go faster than that.
We have met before. Alex Borov, Assemblymember Pappin's office, hello. I just wanted to ask a really quick clarification, I guess, about that 300 to the 100, the difference between, what we would consider to be a professional cyclist versus an average cyclist versus, oh yes, perfect.
Right, let me go back there.
Versus a horse.
There it was, okay.
Perfect. I guess it's just more of just for my understanding. We obviously know that in Europe, we have 250 watts, and then that is in comparison to, for example, an adult on a bicycle at 100 watts. Would you say that it's still, and this may be, I guess, outside of the purview of the report, but would it still be difficult for a regular person on a conventional bicycle to reach what a pro cyclist at 300 watts continuously can do without an e-bike? I mean, is it common to see people?
Well, first of all, I'm just speculating here, and my speculation is probably no better than anybody else in the room, but there's a reason we're not all pro cyclists, so no, you're sort of regular, average, any of us or our family and friends are not going to be generating 300 watts per mile. So yeah, it does, but it's still sort of generally within the realm of what a human can do, and I don't claim to know what's the exact right wattage. Should it be 200? Should it be 250? Should it be 300? That is an important question, and unfortunately, I don't have the expertise to be able to give you a definitive answer on that.
Absolutely. I guess I was asking that with the intent of personally clarifying that, if we regulate to 250 watts and 750 peak, an e-bike will still move faster and, in theory, put someone in more danger than someone on a conventional bicycle on average. Obviously, we can't say that for sure.
Sorry to interrupt, but just one clarifying point is just because a device can go a certain speed doesn't mean that riders necessarily will go that speed. So that's actually another data point that's very interesting, and there's very little I've seen, but like if you stand by the side of the road and you watch e-bikes and pedal bikes go by and you measure their speeds, on average, is there a big difference? And very little data out there, but it suggests it's a small difference, like a few miles per hour. And that's not to say that some e-bikes may be going, 20 miles an hour, but just because, if you have a Porsche, or nowadays a Tesla or whatever, you can easily zip along at 100, any car nowadays can probably go 100 miles an hour, but we don't all. And just because it could go that fast doesn't mean we should assume that everybody is driving at that speed. So.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Just have a couple of small questions. Julius McIntyre from Speaker Revis's office. I was just curious kind of about labeling requirements to kind of move the needle on who can recognize when a bike is, one of these categories, an electric bike versus a traditional bicycle. So has there been any conversations about like manufacturing requiring to put some sort of, obvious label on there so everyone could know like that's an electric bike? The same way we kind of do with electric vehicles with the decals and things
Right.
that used to signify that they were electric vehicles.
So, good question. So right now, in theory, electric bikes are supposed to have a sticker, literally a sticker, class 1, 2, or 3. A lot of the devices don't come with one, and I don't think most members of the public even know there should be a sticker, so they don't even realize. But also, if you spend 20 seconds on Amazon and you look up e-bike sticker, you can buy any class sticker you want, and there is some anecdotal evidence of kids in particular buying, say, a class 1 sticker and putting it on their device. So I believe there is legislation that has been introduced, and David, you may want to add more detail, that would require a more permanent engraving or marking on the frame of the bicycle.
Great.
Do you want to add anything about that?
I mean, there's been legislation introduced that actually requires a license plate.
Well, yeah, but but this is different. I think there's also some legislation that would say, well, instead of a sticker, which, we have something that's more permanent and harder to fake. And I'm sorry, I can't keep all the bills straight in my mind.
Just looking at the data that was on the PowerPoint, I agree with you. It's kind of clear that there's a need for education, across the board. So I was just inquiring about that.
Yeah.
Moving on, just kind of wanted to brainstorm about solutions or proposals, bill ideas to target illegal e-bikes. I happen to know personally that the illegal ones are becoming very, very, very popular, and they're extremely hazardous, so I was just kind of curious about that.
So I'm sorry, the question,
How to target the illegal bikes and kind of scale down some of the sales.
well, I think, I really do think requiring retailers to clearly label what they're selling will help enormously. Because right now, you can, if you do a search for like e-bike, you'll find all kinds of devices that call themselves e-bikes that are not legal e-bikes. And so making it illegal to call yourself that if you're not. And also, but I think sort of maybe more useful is proactively requiring for any bicycle-shaped device sold that has an electric motor, the seller has to tell the consumer and clearly, not like, well, there's a little sticker and if you bothered to read it, but like really inform the consumer what kind of device is being purchased and pointing them to where the rules are for who can use it and where they can use it. I think that will, it doesn't deal with the problem of the devices that have already been sold and are being used, but at least going into the future, I suspect that's probably the most effective way. And then also to, maybe if a bike shop is selling illegal devices and isn't following the rules about labeling them, there's a role probably for the Attorney General, for county, to prosecute so that the retailers know that they need to follow the rules.
Two small statements. I have a 12-year-old son who died off for one of these things for Christmas. And because of my relationship and the concerns that I hear from Mr. Sforza, I declined to purchase that bike.
Okay.
And after Christmas, one of his friends that does have a bike got into a really bad accident.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
8 surgeries, got hit by an 18-wheeler. My son no longer wants an e-bike.
Yeah.
I have a scooter that goes 40 miles an hour. Obviously, it's not a bicycle, but it's obviously shares some of the same significance and concerns. And I just wanted to know, like definition-wise, does any of these classifications or, does any of these affect my scooter?
So your scooter is not legally an e-bike. So no. And actually, we're here to talk about e-bikes, but in the state motor vehicle code, there are like dirt bikes and off-road bikes. There's this whole like ecosystem of two-wheeled devices, each with different rules.
Right.
And it is incredibly confusing. And in the long run, I would hope we might further simplify all of this.
I hope so.
Yes, but I think your scooter is there is a scooter set of rules. We have a sort of summary in our report, if you want to look, although don't, do your own due diligence and look beyond that. But I'm sure your 12-year-old would not be able to legally, as I think you know, ride your scooter. And I'm sorry about his friend. Yeah.
Thank you, Doctor.
I guess I can quickly follow up on that. Unlike e-bikes, scooters have a speed limit, but do not have a speed limitation on their design. And so you legally cannot go faster than 15 miles an hour on a scooter, but there is not a speed cap on the design of them. And there was legislation a few years ago to try to put a speed cap on scooters, and that legislation died in the Senate.
It's kind of interesting now that there's a lot of discussion, or I shouldn't say a lot, but some discussion of speed governors or limiters on vehicles, which obviously we don't have right now, but we could technologically at this point. It wouldn't be hard. Actually, we could have done it probably 50 years ago quite easily. Do we rely on people's good judgment? Do we, use these technological limits? It's an open question. But I think it's good to think about it for all devices, not just for one.
I have just one last question, and I apologize if you don't know the answer, but looking at Europe and looking at the other countries that have this much lower wattage requirement, were you able to look at what their crash data look like and how it compares to the United States and California from the limited data you had?
Sort of. So we did a sort of global literature review. I mean, it was things published in English. We ended up looking at studies from around the world, and we did pull out those that compared injuries or crash rates for e-bikes with either conventional bikes or e-scooters. It's hard because, first of all, a lot of that data is not very recent, and they have the same problems that we do of like what is getting labeled as an e-bike. I don't think I have a good answer for you, but it's a very important question.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. And thank you for the work. The report is available. We can make sure to get it out to people. It's 170 pages long. It was incredibly impressive. And in the back of the room, you can get a 2-pager on the report. And we'll be able to get this up on our website. And so this will be available as a recording. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and have a wonderful day.